Hello and welcome to the channel. In this video, we will learn to create a basic GET API in a Spring Boot project. And for now, we will just return a simple string in the response of that GET API. And we will do the dissection of entire API, which we are going to create soon, so that you will get to understand the entire concept under the hood and the working in the depth. So now let's start creating that without any further delay. So in the video, I am going to use the basic Spring Boot project which we had created in the last video. So let me open that in the IntelliJ. So this was the project which we had created in the last video. And in the project, we have only one class which is Learn Spring Boot application. And this class has the main method. To create the API, first we will create one more directory inside this Learn Spring Boot directory. And we will name that as controller, and we'll keep all the APIs in this controller directory itself, which we will create in the entire Spring Boot course. Now we will create one class inside this controller directory, and let's say we just want to create one simple API which tells or which returns in the response one simple string, which is the service is healthy. So because that API is telling about the health of that service, so let's say we keep the name of that class as health controller. So I will name that class and I will click on this. So our class is ready now, in which we will create the get API. So when the service will be up after creating the API and we hit that API, so we should get the response stating that the service is healthy. Now to create the API inside this class, we will create one method, and which will be a public method. So I will write public, and because that method or that API will return the string, so the return type will be string. And let's keep the method name as health API, and which will return a string. This service is healthy. Okay, so that's the string which we want in the response of that API. Now because we want some data as the response of this API and we are not updating anything through that API, so this particular API will be of get type. So if I go to the postman, so you would see different methods are here: get, post, put, patch, delete. So because we are getting some information from that API in terms of the response, so we will keep the HTTP method as the get. And the purpose of these post, put, patch, all those are different, so we'll talk about this in some other video, but for now we'll keep this as get method. So to define that it will be a get API, so we need to use one annotation which is get mapping. So this will be the annotation for that, and this is defined in this org.springframework.web.bind.annotation. So this is defined inside this particular package. So this particular annotation will come into picture whenever we will hit this API using the postman or through browser, and we select the HTTP method from here. So then only this particular get mapping will be useful. So we will see that in action in a while. And we will also see if we do not specify anything as the HTTP method for the API, then what will be the behavior of our API. So we'll see that also in couple of minutes. So now we need to give some path to this particular API. So whenever we hit any API, first of all, we define some host at the first place, then we use some port on which the service is serving. After that, we specify the path for that API. So to define the path, we use this bracket, and inside that we use one parameter which is the value, and inside that we define the path. So let's suppose, because this is a health API, so let's keep this health. So now after defining this, whenever we will hit this API, so we will use localhost, because I am going to launch the application on my local system. So localhost will be the host, and because it will be using the 8080 port by default, so the 8080 will be used after localhost, and then slash health we will use. So we will see that in a while. Let me show you in the postman itself. So we will call this particular API like this, localhost, that will be the host, and the 8080 will be the port. And because we have kept the API path as slash health, so this will be the way through which we will hit that particular API. And we have defined the method, HTTP method of that API as get. So we will keep this as get here, and then we will send the request. So this is the way we define the path for a API. So that's all. Our first API is ready, except just one little thing. So we have created the API, but how will Spring Boot come to know that the API is defined in this particular class, which is health controller? So for that, so the Spring Boot come to know about this particular API, we need to define one more annotation, which will be at the class level. So because of that annotation, Spring Boot come to know that we have defined some API in this particular class. So the annotation which we need to remember will be this REST controller. So which is defined in this particular package, org dot spring framework dot web dot bind dot annotation. So we will use this REST controller annotation here. Because of this annotation, Spring Boot will discover this particular health controller class, and all the APIs which are defined or which we have created in this class will be discoverable and will become active whenever we want to hit the API from the postman or the browser. So now everything is completed as far as this particular API is concerned. So now we will start this particular application. So I will go to this Learn Spring Boot application, and I will click over here and I will say learn spring boot.main, so that our application will get started. So it got started, and as you can see, Tomcat started on port 8080, which is by default. And so we have used the embedded Tomcat server here to launch the application. Now to hit the API, I'll go to the postman. So on the postman, if I hit the API now, so congratulations, you got the response which was expected. The service is healthy, which we have returned in this particular API. So the service is healthy, which we have returned here, and we got here in the response. Now we will do some tweaking in the code and try to understand the behavior of that. So we will go again to the IntelliJ. So first of all, let's dissect this particular REST controller annotation. So if I go inside this, so I'll just press command and click. So here, as you can see, so this is the convenience annotation that itself annotated with controller and at the rate response body. So as you can see, the at the rate controller and at the rate response body. So these two annotations are mandatory to make the API work properly. So instead of defining this REST controller, if I use at the rate controller and at the rate response body separately, so that would also work. So I will go again to the health controller, and let me close other tabs as well. So here if you see this REST controller, so if I remove this and use the at the rate controller and at the rate response body, which is this one, and let me remove this import as well. So now if I rerun our application, so using this option stop and rerun, let's wait for few seconds. So the application is started. Now I will go to the postman and let me clear the response first. Now if I hit send, so congratulations, your API is still working. So what is the use of this controller and what is the use of this response body? So the controller is doing the work to make this particular class discoverable to the Spring Boot, so that Spring Boot come to know that there is one API which it needs to make active, and so that if we hit that API, so it will be listening on that API. And the response body, let's talk about this response body annotation. So this at the response body annotation tells the controller that the returned object is automatically serialized and passed back to the HTTP response object. So what I mean by that, so whenever we use the response body annotation on a method, or let's say in the class, so at we have used the response body annotation at the class level, so it means it is automatically applied to each method which we will define and or we have defined in this class. So whenever we are using this particular annotation on a method or the class level, so Spring converts the return value, which is this particular string in our case, and after converting this or serialize this, it writes to the HTTP response automatically. So we do not need to write this particular string in the HTTP response, but it is doing that in automatically. The Spring is doing automatically. So if I show you the documentation also, so the annotation that indicates a method return value should be bound to the web response body. It might not be in the language that is easily understandable. So you can understand this something like that it is necessary so that we we get the expected response in the serialized way. So I'll go back. So let's see if we do not use this particular annotation. So let's remove this, and if I so let's remove this import as well. So if I rerun this application, okay, let me go to the postman now. So if I hit this button, so as you can see, this particular API is not found now, because we don't have, like, the Spring don't have anything to return in the response. So we got the not found response in this particular API because Spring doesn't have anything so that it can be returned in the response. So this is the behavior if we do not use the response body annotation. Okay, so let's rewrite this to REST controller, and let me remove this import. Now we will dissect this GetMapping annotation. So if I go inside this GetMapping annotation, so here you can see there is this value which we have used, and if I go inside this request mapping, so because this is alias for this particular request mapping dot class, so if I go inside this, so here also you would see this value, and this is alias for path, and the path is defined here. So instead of value we can use the path as well. So let's use path here. So I will go again to the health controller, and if I use path here, and if I rerun the application, let's see if it works as expected. Okay, so this is started. Let me clear the response and hit send. Okay, congratulations. So this is also working if we are using the path here instead of value. Now instead of get mapping, we can use the request mapping, which we saw in this particular get mapping annotation. So request mapping also we can use. So let's go back and use the request mapping and see what is the behavior now. Let me remove this, and but to make this work, request mapping, we need to define the get HTTP method, because currently Spring does not know whether what is the HTTP method here. So to define the method, we have one method parameter here, and here we would need to do request method dot get. So after defining this, let's rerun the application. Now the application is restarted. I will go to the postman and clear response, hit send. Okay, so it is working fine now. But let's see if I do not use this particular method, what will happen then. So I will remove this import as well. I will restart the application, whether it will work or not, whether it will even start the application or not. So it is started. successfully. Now I will go to the postman, I will clear the response. Now if I hit send, okay, so it is working. But what happens if I do not use the get, if I use the post? So what will happen in this case? So let me hit send. Oh wow, so it is also giving the response in the case of post. Let's use some other HTTP method. Okay, so it is giving the same response in each HTTP method. Now let me revert that particular change here, which was okay, let's rather keep this here, get mapping. And there is one more thing which we can do if we do not use path. So this is another way by which we can create the API. If we don't have any other argument to pass here, then we can, there is no need to give the path or the value here. But if we want to give some other, let's suppose method or name, anything we want to give here, let's suppose name we want to give, then we need to pass or we need to use some value or path here. But if we do not want to give any other argument here, then this is also optional, so we can remove that. And now like this, if we restart the application, okay, so the application is started. Now if I go to the postman and I will keep this get, and if I hit send, so it is working fine. Or let me show you one more thing. So if we change this to post, so what will happen that? So last time when we did not give any HTTP method here, then it was working fine. But let's see in this case. So in this case it is saying status 405, this method is not allowed. So it means the health API, so it does not give the 404, which is not found. So this is different than 404. So 404 means this particular API is not, does not exist. But in the case of 405 it is saying method not found or method not allowed. So it means the API exists, but the method which we are using here in the postman, it is not allowed. So okay, let's go to the IntelliJ again. Okay, so let's see if we use the post here instead of get. So if we use post here and we are not updating anything or we are not inserting new data in this API, and we are just returning one simple string, which is sort of we are getting some information out of this particular API's response. And but we are using the post mapping here. Let me remove this import as well. So let's see what will happen and what will be the behavior of this API now, whether it will give some error or what. So let me rerun this application. Okay, so I'll go to the postman now, and now I will clear the response. Let me keep this get first. So it is saying method not allowed because we are sending the get HTTP method here, but there is not any API which exists with the get method. So now we'll keep this post, and if I hit send now, so it is working like we saw in the case of get. So there is no any difference in the behavior of this particular case where we have changed this to post mapping and kept the entire code as it is. So let's see if we change this to delete. So in this case also, let's rerun the application. Let's see in action. So I will go and clear the response. Again, if I hit now when we have the post here, so this will give the 405 method not allowed. But if I change this to delete, then it will give the response which we have written here. So through this we got to learn that it does not matter whatever mapping we keep here. It's just that whatever mapping we will use here, we will define here, we need to send the exact same HTTP method here, and technically it will not give any error. But it is a convention that if we want to get some data from the API, then we should use the get HTTP method while defining the API or while creating the API. And if we are inserting some new data, then we should use the post mapping And if we want to delete some data, then we should use this delete mapping here. Similarly, if we want to update some existing data, then we should use the put mapping. So this is convention, but if we use some other HTTP method compared to the convention, it will not give any error, but it is advisable to follow the convention so that it will be a standard practice and other developers do not get confused, and it will be considered as a good code practice. So let me know in the comments if you want a separate and dedicated video on these request methods, and if you found the video useful and you are learning something from the Spring Boot course videos, then show me some support by liking the video and subscribing the channel. In the next video, we will create the post API and we'll do the dissection of that API also. Let me know in the comments what did you like in the video and what you didn't like in the video. If you got to learn anything new in the video, then let me know through comments regarding the feedback. So you can also provide the feedback or suggestion through our support email ID or through comments itself. Keep learning, keep supporting, and subscribe the channel if you want to become a skilled engineer. Stay safe. See you in the next video.